This is the Soul-Filled Sisterhood podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole Burgess, licensed marriage and family therapist and an empowerment mentor for women. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute, nor is it to convey professional, psychological, financial, or medical advice. If you could use such services, please seek them out from someone you trust. Now here is today's episode. Episode 48. Well, welcome, sisters. I am so excited about my guest today. I have Lauren Selfridge on, and she is an associate marriage and family therapist living with multiple sclerosis. She's the host of This Is Not What I Ordered, which is an interview podcast on full heart living with chronic illness and health challenges. Lauren believes that difficult experiences with our bodies are an invitation to deepen and enrich our lives and develop even more conscious relationships with ourselves. This is such an important topic. She loves supporting folks living with health challenges to shine the light of their unique gifts, passions, and personalities in the world, and to create lives of meaning after diagnosis. Life with MS hasn't been an easy path for Lauren, but it has been a good one. So Lauren, first, I just want to say thank you so much for being on, and I'm so looking forward to our conversation today.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I would love if you would share with my listeners really what got you into this work.
Well, when I became a therapist, when I first started working with clients, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis just about a month into that journey. So
wow.
I started the therapy path because I was really passionate about couples work and relationships and helping people understand how to have healthy relationships, because I think it's one of the most important topics that we can talk about in the world. Mm-hmm. I just feel like relationships are where a lot of growth and transformation can happen. And just like life, I didn't plan for all that came along on the journey with this diagnosis, because nobody plans to get diagnosed with a disease. And so although my path in my heart and mind was couples work, which by the way, I still do and I'm still passionate about, I also found out that there was this other part of my life that was just beginning to sprout, which is developing an identity with multiple sclerosis, meaning making sense of it for myself and eventually kind of creating my own story about it that works for me. And so in that process, I created this podcast and have been really loving that. And I've also begun specializing in working with people living with health challenges because I see it as a transformation journey. And I've just so enjoyed this unexpected part of my path as a therapist. And now I do personal consultation with people all over the world who want to live awesome lives with health challenges and chronic illness. And it's all because I have done that work and I'm continuing to do that work inside of myself.
I love that. And I'm sitting here shaking my head. And of course, people can't see this. I say this often on my podcast. I'm like, oh yeah. I love how, as you've gone through your own stages, which we're going to get into in just a second about some of the guests that you've even had on your podcast, but how you've really turned this more into an opportunity versus, I know sometimes people can really get stuck in, this really sucks. I don't know what else to do. And you've really allowed yourself to pivot and help others see there's options, there's possibilities, not limitations.
Yes, absolutely. And what's cool is that part of that is going through the really challenging stuff. That's the opposite of what feels like a pivot. So
yes.
Like going through that darkness, which is part of the transformation journey as well, as being willing to feel all the feelings that show up on the way.
And I think that's everybody's path, whether it's a health challenge or not. There's, what we call that dark night of the soul, right? It is looking at those shadow sides. It's going deep into the so-called scary stuff, which is like what you're saying is the challenges, and saying, okay, let me stay curious in this. Let me feel all the feels, like you're saying, so that I can truly move through it and not get stuck in it.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I know on your podcast, I was telling you earlier before I started to record that I was listening to some of your guests and in your interviews where some of them, once they got the diagnosis of whether it was a chronic illness or a health challenge, how there is this grieving stage many of them have had to go through. And I'm wondering if you would share a little bit about kind of that grief stage, which is really normal when we have a loss, whether it's an actual death or it's an actual loss or change within our own lives.
Yes. And I know growing up for me, I thought, about my future and what do I want to be when I grow up? And everything about my future had to do with external circumstances, like what's my job? Where do I live? Who am I with? And all of that. And so much can get attached to that related to our physical health. And we assume, or at least I assumed growing up, that I wouldn't even really have to think about my body and my health. And so to come to a place where I realized that, oh my gosh, there are a bunch of physical limitations that go along with having a chronic illness. And some of them are unknown because everybody's path with my particular illness, MS, is different. So we don't know what's going to happen down the line. So there's this whole big, scary uncertainty in the future. And so there is a grieving process that happens, I think, for most people who have their sense of their physical health shifted in such a drastic way. And so grieving is this thing that I think that in some ways there can be, when we're ready, we start to feel those difficult feelings. I'm a big fan of denial. And the reason I say that is because I think denial gets a bad rap. I think it's one of the really helpful parts of being human that allows us to get through a particularly challenging time without taking all of the feelings in at once. And so I think of it as like a little dose of a break from feeling sometimes. And that's part of, as we all know, it's one of the stages of grief too, is denial. But the whole thing about grieving is that, I feel like there have been moments in time, like days, weeks, and sometimes months, where I've been able to feel like I'm going through the hard, scary grieving process. I also believe that grieving process is one that takes place over the course of a lifetime, because there are different parts of having this illness that maybe I haven't thought of before, or I'll come face to face with a new limitation. And then I'm starting back at, okay, this makes sense. Starting with validating myself. It makes sense that I feel scared. It makes sense that I'm mad. It makes sense that I feel hopeless in this moment. And knowing that it's okay to feel all those feelings is what, like we just said, is what allows us to continue living and to keep transforming. And so almost like knowing, just like I know that my MS is going to be part of the journey, knowing also that my grief is going to be part of the journey, that it's not going to be rejected and that it's allowed, has really been helpful to me, because I feel like that process has been kind of like an emotional boot camp where I'm becoming more resilient because I'm more able to be with those difficult feelings.
That is a beautiful metaphor, the emotional boot camp. I think you've totally hit it, that none of us can predict the future. And even with whether you get diagnosed with a chronic illness or a health condition, okay, this is a part of it, a piece of it. And like you were saying, it's like, I don't know how this is going to unfold as life continues forward, but really giving yourself permission to feel all the things that are going to come up. And like you're saying too, sometimes we really need to stay, I sometimes call it the pit. Like you really need to stay in the mucky, murky, yucky stuff for a little bit, so that you don't get quite overwhelmed with all the intensity of the other emotions. It's just like, just be there for a little bit, and you will eventually, take that next step and work through that. But really, then again, like you're saying, is allowing yourself to feel all these things, giving yourself permission to talk about it, be in it, does make you more resilient, because you're truly not getting stuck in trying to live from the past. You're like, this is where I am right now in this moment.
Right. Exactly.
So let me live life.
Totally. And that's been part of, the boot camp reference is kind of funny because I think about those fitness boot camps that you can sign up for. But the big difference, of course, is you don't really get to pick this boot camp. It just shows up for you. So you're not choosing it. And that's part of why I named my podcast This Is Not What I Ordered.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I didn't choose it, it's something that has brought a lot of material and aliveness into my life.
Mm-hmm.
And that I am, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be meeting myself on a whole new level.
Well, I think it's funny, we humans, right? I love the delusion that we have created for ourselves. Like we've got so much more control over things than we actually do. And so when life does hand us things, you're like, wait, that wasn't in my plan. It's like, yeah, well, honey, the world doesn't work the way you want it. It works the way how the laws of the universe works.
It's so true. And it's so like, we can laugh about it now because I think that part of what gets me through is being able to laugh and the humor about all of it. And then also the truth that even though I know that, I still have those periods where I'm like, but it's still so hard.
Yes. Yeah. It's not the either or, it's the both and.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's like I can laugh and I can have those moments of just like, wow, this is challenging at times.
Yeah. And even being a person with a podcast and I share, how do I get through difficult things? And I'm pretty honest that, there's nothing about me that says I'm always happy or I'm always feeling great about my body and disease and how it's all working out. But even though I've had these episodes where I've created like, here's how I deal with the difficult symptom and here's how I can do this mindfulness exercise and all of that, I still, like last week had one of the symptoms that I'm very familiar with and I know exactly what works for me and how to manage it. And yet I still had this sense that I just felt defeated. And it's understanding that that's to be expected in some way, that even though I have all these great tools, that it's still going to be disappointing sometimes. And it's still going to be frustrating that I have to deal with this. And it's just like riding those waves,
Exactly. I was just going to say, and that's really what makes us all so human.
Yeah.
Right. It's knowing that there really are so many different vulnerabilities and knowing it's like, okay, this is just like you're saying, it is the ride the wave because eventually I'll come back to the shore. Another time, another moment. But in those moments, it's like, oh my gosh, really? Now? This sucks. What?
And there's this part of me that's like, but I have a podcast on this. I shouldn't be upset about it. Oh, if only it was that simple.
Nope. So not. We're going to keep it real.
Yeah.
Well, I love though how, again, this message that at least that I am hearing from you is as you're going through this, you really continue to be truly the leader of your own life. That even when you have gotten this diagnosis, even when you are now managing this health condition, it's like, I'm still the leader in my life and I'm no longer allowing things to just kind of rule me out of basically being unconscious. You're being very intentional and conscious of the relationships that you're creating and where you're going in your life. Right. And I'm wondering, do you have, or what kind of what helps keep you inspired? What kind of support system do you have that really helps keep you moving forward in this way?
Well, there are a few different ways that I serve my heart in all of this. And one of them is by being in touch with nature when I can. And I also want to just put an asterisk on that and say, I don't think you have to be outside in order to connect with nature.
Yes.
Especially for folks who aren't getting out much because of physical limitations. I think it's still something that is very much an important part of connection, at least for me. And so I love walking to the ocean and I love, feeling the air on my skin. And if I'm not outside, maybe I'm looking out the window and I'm, cloud gazing or stargazing, or closing my eyes and imagining myself outside and imagining a really vivid scenario of being connected with nature. So that's one big one for me. And then also watercolor painting has been such a saving grace, especially when I'm in the midst of symptoms. What I find is if I'm able to paint, that the whole time that I'm painting, I'm not thinking about my symptoms.
Yeah. And you're in the flow is what they call that. Yeah.
Exactly. There's a flow and it is a little bit of relief. And it's not necessarily that the symptoms go away, it's that my worry about them goes away. And that is a wonderful relief. And then I also have amazing people in my life, friends and loved ones who I can either talk to in person, or I use the app called Marco Polo, and we video each other, especially in the chronic illness community. I think being able to be in touch from bed or from your living room or wherever is really, really helpful in keeping us from feeling isolated.
That's beautiful. I was not aware of that app. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Humans in general, right? We know this even from your conversation, just relationships are important. And I know as MFTs, that's kind of our training is all about relationships and systems. And if you cannot get out of your house or you cannot get out of your bed, yeah, it's like that desire and that innate part of ourselves doesn't just disappear.
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, I think it's greater. And so I think that need for connection is so, so important when we're living with physical limitations. And that's part of what I'm loving about the online communities that are out there. I mean, even just being on social media, the chronic illness community is so active.
Oh, that's great.
So connected. It's just wonderful to open up my social media feeds and see the normalization of having, like, people will post, hey, I'm in the hospital again. This is a picture of my IV bag. And people are able to chime in and they're able to joke together. They're able to give really deep empathy and really get it in a way that not everybody gets it.
But it also takes away the stigma. I mean, there's so much in whether it comes to mental health, whether it comes to, health conditions, whether it comes to just being different in general. Oh my goodness. There's still so many stigmas out there. Instead of embracing the differences and wanting to learn more, it's like we can constantly seem to want to fight against one another on it. And I love that you're seeing this through the community, that people are really coming together and supporting one another and joking about some things too. That it's like, yeah, let's continue to join forces versus become the us versus them.
Yeah, it's been really special to, even as somebody who is not an expert at social media, when I created the podcast, learning about new hashtags and following those hashtags and just, oh my gosh, just meeting it's like I have new friends now because of social media and the ability to reach out to people all over the world. And it's just been such a blessing.
Yeah. Well, I'm laughing more because I still struggle with the social media stuff. It's like I still have this love-hate relationship. I'm like, well, there's a hashtag for that? Oh, okay.
Oh my gosh, yes. There's a hashtag for everything now.
Right. Yeah. Well, again, I love that you're really, for our listeners, if you have a health condition or a chronic condition, it's like, go look some of these things up. And I'm going to put, Lauren's information again in the show notes and all that stuff. Where you can connect with her as well. But it's like, get curious. And so that you know that you do not have to do this by yourself, or that if you're feeling very disconnected, create these connections, that it is absolutely possible to do this.
Yeah, it is the club that nobody wanted to be invited to, but that we're in. And so when I learn about somebody with some health challenge, I say, I'm sorry that we're in this club, but also I'm really glad we're in this club together.
Yeah. Well, there it is. It's like, again, like your podcast name, it's like, you guys didn't order it. And at the same time, it's like, hey, but we do have one another, that we can be here for one another, that you don't have to navigate this all by yourself.
Exactly.
Oh, I love it. For the listeners out here, what are some things maybe to help them really bring home this message of not only the self-care, but really doing things that work specifically for them? Like, what are some maybe permission-giving slips in the sense of what would be helpful for them if they're struggling with something, or they have just had a recent diagnosis of like, hey, here's some things that you've learned over the years, and maybe even some of the clients that you've worked with that have really kind of taught you, like, hey, when I've done this, it's really helped me out, type of thing.
Yeah. Well, here's something that I was so fortunate that a friend introduced me to a friend of his who happened to have an autoimmune disease, she said something to me at the beginning, and I said it in my second episode where I talk about my journey. I don't remember the exact words, but she didn't sugarcoat life with chronic illness for me. It was like a few days after my diagnosis. But what she did do was she said, even though it's not going to be easy, it is going to be magnificent. It's like standing at the foot of a bright mountain. She said, you will find reserves of strength and resilience in yourself that you didn't even know you had. And I get chills just thinking about it.
That is powerful.
That was the message that I needed to hear, because there was something in me that resonated with that message that said, I like that. I want to hold on to that concept.
Yeah.
And it is something that I would continue to offer from my own heart, to say that, yeah, chronic illness, I wouldn't wish it on anybody. Let's not pretend that that's the way to, the only way to fulfillment or anything.
Right.
Yet at the same time, I really do see it as like a fast forward button on finding meaning in my life and finding out what I really care about and value versus what I've been told I'm supposed to care about and value. So when we go back to that picture of when I was little and all the external circumstances that I envisioned for myself, that isn't nearly as important to me now when I look at how important my relationship with myself has become, how necessary that strong relationship has become, so that regardless of what happens externally in my world, I'm going to be there for me. So when I think about my future now, I have all these what if scenarios that come up, and that's totally normal. And then in my best moments, I can follow those what if scenarios up with, and what do I know about myself? Well, what I know is that I'm a really good team player with myself. I'm really good at having my own back. I'm really good at being kind to myself, and I can bring that with me no matter what happens. So then all the fear that I have of losing things in my life that I thought were important starts to shift. And I'm not living from that place of fear as much, because I'm realizing that what I really need is something that I can cultivate within me no matter what. So if MS is part of what it took to get there, then fine. I think chronic illness can be a way of looking at what we really care about and fostering our relationship with ourselves.
Absolutely. And it makes me think of, I've had another conversation on a different podcast where I talked about, the midlife unraveling, and it's still that conversation between first half of life and second half of life. And this, getting diagnosed with a chronic health condition, it's like, wow, that was one moment here in your first half of life, which is all about those, preconceived beliefs. You need to do this, the shoulds that so many women live under, the masks that are put on, to whoop, let's take that away. What works for Lauren? What works for you now?
Right.
What's really, truly important to you?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so many and I mostly work with women in my psychotherapy practice and in my personal consulting practice. And also I have a lot of women friends. And there's this thing that happens where there's some point in life, that question of what do I want for me versus what does everybody else want for me? And that's such an important moment, because that's when the fun begins, and it can be
freedoms.
Often we're shedding a lot of other people's stories and a lot of other people's expectations, and there's pain in that, and maybe part of our identity was pleasing others, but shedding that can be one of the most liberating things. And so now, with my MS, it's like, wow, I actually literally don't have the physical energy to do as much stuff that isn't important to me. So I might as well use the energy that I do have to do things that I really, really love. And so now I know it's up to me to fill my day with those things, versus kind of taking a back seat and saying, oh, if I get my work done, I can walk to the ocean. And now it's like, no, that is part of my work. That's part of my job, is to, when I have the ability to get outside, or to get out my paintbrushes, or to call someone who I love talking to, because my day is supposed to be filled with that stuff. It's not supposed to be filled with stuff that other people want me to be doing instead.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Especially here in the US, I think, where those priorities honestly are flipped. It's like you need to hustle more and do what everybody else thinks you're supposed to do, or whatever that, concept is that you may be living under. And then when you take that off, it's like, no, I'm going to put me first, because when I do that, I can actually do less of some of those shoulds and more of what is truly meaningful and actually give back in a much more powerful way than I could if I didn't feed me first.
It's so true. There are things on the other side of taking care of ourselves that we never could have imagined if we just stayed in the fear of, well, I have to do all these other things, whether it's expectations of family or working in a job that's not fulfilling to me. But I think that that's the only way for me to get my needs met. That when I shift into what I actually really want to do and love, and I do more of it, even if there's not an immediate outcome that I know is going to serve me, except for joy, which, by the way, is a pretty awesome one.
Yeah, I was going to say, wait, that's a really good one.
then I start living my life from joy, and there's less fear, and so then there are things that happen that I couldn't have even imagined, and so. Yeah. I'm a big fan. I joke that I'm a joy consultant because that's one of the first questions I ask people when they come to me for guidance is like, well, what do you love doing? And sometimes the answer is, I don't know. And there can be a lot of shame associated with that. And I think to myself, there's no shame in that. I'm so glad that we're talking now because this is going to be a really awesome scavenger hunt. Like we're going to find out together.
Well, I think, for many women, there's that I've had people tell me, they're like, oh my gosh, to actually pause and reflect on what I want, it was like a foreign concept to them. And so as like what you're saying, the scavenger hunt, as when we got curious about things and just explored various avenues, all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, I really am liking this. That this was really easy for me to do. Is that going back to like your watercolors and it was just being in the flow of that. And it's like, looky there. There's step one. We've got some curiosity. And step two is just allowing yourself to be in those moments and then expanding that a little more to see what unfolds.
Yes, it is so cool.
It is. It is. Oh, well, Lauren, I'm curious. Is there anything else that maybe I'm kind of missing that you would like to share or talk about with the listeners, like things that you've learned, or again, if there's other lessons or something that else kind of pops out to you that's like, wow, this is something that I continue to share as I move forward as well, or...
So one thing I can share is my favorite way of dealing with symptoms for me. And I'll just preface this by saying the only symptoms I have experience with practicing this with are my own. I've never been in any other body where I know what it's like to have a different kind of symptom. For me, my main symptoms are brain fog, dizziness, and fatigue. And so what I've developed is this approach to illness, to my own, when those symptoms show up, where it's almost like using a mindfulness exercise. We learn in psychotherapy school that allowing our emotions to be exactly as they are is part of the healing process and a part of the transformation process. And that, if anyone who practices mindfulness likely has gotten the instruction that when a thought or a feeling shows up, that we welcome it, and instead of condemning it, we experience it without judgment. If we're really practicing, we get to find moments of non-judgment, which is pretty exciting. Well, I started to apply that to my symptoms when they arise, because what would happen, especially for the first few years, is like I would get dizzy and I would get mad, or I would get really frustrated or scared or disappointed that I didn't get to feel as present the way that I'm used to feeling present. And there was a lot of resistance where I just kept waiting for it to go away. It was like, fine, I'm just going to lie down till it's gone. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. I kind of got bored of that way of responding to it, though. It's not very satisfying. It's kind of like, oh, it's just this terrible thing comes in and everything stops, and my life has to stop for this thing. So I started applying those same mindfulness and emotional response techniques to my symptoms. And I started to invite them in, like almost welcome them in on purpose in my mind, kind of see them as an important, like I call it making my symptom my tour guide. So it's like, you're in charge right now. And I know that can feel kind of scary, because it's like, oh no, if I let my symptom take over, what will happen? Well, for me, it was more of a playful relationship. Like, oh, like, okay, you want it? It's almost like a little kid that's like, here, I want to show you my toy room or whatever. Like, come with me. And they take your hand and you're like, oh, I don't know. Like, okay, I guess we can, like, okay, we'll play with toys or whatever. But for the symptoms, when they show up and I do that, I find that there's just another state that they're bringing me to. It's another state that I'm not used to. And it's something that when I meet it without the resistance, it isn't a bad state necessarily. It's not a horrible thing. Now, that's not always true for everybody's symptoms. So this isn't necessarily the best tool for everyone. And I know that there have been times when I feel pain, and I have a whole other way of responding to pain than this. But with the dizziness and the fatigue and with the brain fog, what I do is I just notice who I am while that's happening. And what I find is there's often this lighter sense. There's like, my ego isn't quite as strong. My sense of openness, expansiveness is there. Like, I'm a little bit more improvisational when I get into that place of allowing my symptom to be my tour guide. And I'm kind of asking it, like, what do you want me to know? Like, how can I be right now? And, isn't this interesting? Isn't this exciting sometimes? And I find I think I'm more fun.
Well, I was going to say, the way you describe it is you are much more playful, which then doesn't trigger the amygdala, like, holy cow, we got a saber-tooth tiger we need to fight against.
Yeah.
That gets to stay calm. And it's just like, let's see what's going to happen here. Okay, show me around.
Yeah. And like, often as an adult, just, I don't want to go into play with toys with a kid or whatever. It's like when you really give yourself to that situation with a child, even if you're not in the mood to play with the toys, and you really just hang out with them, it's usually pretty darn fun. Like, you get down on the floor and you're like, okay, I guess we're playing with sharks and kittens or whatever, like whatever's happening. And it's that I'm not in control of it, but I'm surrendering to it, and I'm allowing it to have its own life, and I'm showing up for it. And it becomes like a relationship inside of myself between me and the symptom.
Beautiful. That is really, really beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I know I kind of put you on the spot there, so I appreciate you.
No, I like it. That's good.
Yeah. Well, Lauren, I just want to say again, thank you so much for being on. And ladies, again, I'm going to list off some things that Lauren has given me, and I'm going to have the rest of it on the show notes. But if you want to find out a little more about her podcast and stuff, you can go out to her website, which is thisisnotwhatiordered.com. It's all one word. And again, if you're driving, don't worry, you can go out to the show notes and look it up. She also has a free guide, which is 16 questions to help you tune into your heart when living with a chronic illness. And that's if you go to her website, laurenselfridge.com/listener bonus. And then if you want a free consult, she has it under that same website, which is /work with Lauren. So there's multiple ways that you can get in touch with her. And again, kind of check out some of her free goodies that she's got here. And I just want to say thank you again for sharing what your own path has been and continues to be, but also how to let other women who are listening to this be able to say, you don't have to do this alone, that there are definitely communities, there's definitely support, and that you kind of like, hey, I'm over here and I can help out with all of this.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's so fun to talk to you.
If you are a high-achieving, introverted, and sensitive entrepreneur, I invite you to go out to my Facebook group. You go out to Introverted, Sensitive Women Achievers. Thank you so much for listening.